On the line with us is the director of the Neuroscience Center for Anxiety, Stress, and Trauma at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences of Wayne State University School of Medicine outside Detroit in Michigan, Dr. Seth D. Norrholm, PhD. Wayne Medicine is the Twitter handle. Dr. Norrholm, welcome to the program. You've done some, really brilliant writing here and commentary on sociopaths and psychopaths and all that sort of thing. I'm very glad you could join us today. Can we start with the difference between a sociopath and a psychopath as these words get tossed around?
Yeah, good to be here, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
When we think about these terms, sociopath and psychopath, they're used as more of umbrella terms to discuss what's underneath, which is personality disorders. And there is a common thread between sociopaths and psychopaths, which is doing things that are against society, which is where the term antisocial comes from, an antisocial personality disorder. So doing things that would harm other people without remorse from a very self-centered and selfish standpoint. And so when you think about a sociopath, you think about somebody who's doing these things repeatedly against the interests of others for the interests of themselves. And when you get into psychopathy or a psychopath, really what you're talking about is crossing over a line between doing things without remorse, like lying and being deceptive and engaging in potentially harmful or violent acts, to taking pleasure in it. This term we use is sadism. So do you take pleasure in inflicting harm on other people? Do you seek out other people for retribution for harms they have done to you? And do you enact plans to do something to them? So loosely speaking, that's how we describe sociopathy and psychopathy, as being elements of disordered personalities that are antisocial in nature, but then a degree to which the individual feels anything for the individuals that are harmed, or actually feels elated or feels better by harming other people.
It seems like it's important to make a distinction here. If we're talking about, for example, the policy in the Trump administration that Stephen Miller was apparently quite excited about, of tearing children away from their mothers and then shuffling them off into a private, quote, Christian adoption system where literally hundreds of them have vanished. We have no idea where these children are now. The Biden administration has been unable to find all of them. That's one thing, right? On the other hand, if the kind of the old Bruce Willis movie thing, where daughter gets kidnapped by bad guys and dad goes out to save her and ends up killing a couple of the bad guys, and feeling very righteous about it. That's not psychopathy, but the Stephen Miller characterization, I assume you probably don't want an individual here on the radio, but I'll take responsibility for that. But these kind of policy decisions that intentionally inflict harm, can you speak to the distinction between those two things?
Yeah, and it's really great that you brought up the term righteous, because we use this idea of righteousness a lot. And when you think about what righteousness means, it means, are you doing something for a principled reason? And oftentimes that is the dichotomy of good versus evil. So if you are fighting the forces of evil, like going after the attackers of your daughter or kidnappers, you're doing something that's righteous because you're battling evil, and that can be justified. And so righteousness is right in line with this idea of justified. When you talk about it from a sociopathic standpoint, that idea of righteousness becomes terribly skewed and horribly misinterpreted. So if you mention somebody that's in the Trump administration who is a proponent of this child separation policy, using this idea of righteousness, they have to convince themselves and other people that those that are being separated or having their children taken from them are an enemy of sorts. And so that's when you get into areas of misinformation and propaganda, where you're trying to convince other people that the people you are targeting are enemies. They're coming for your jobs. They're coming to commit violent crimes. They're invading our dominion as the United States of America, and they don't belong here. So they use this very skewed form of righteousness to justify acts which we would describe in layman's terms as evil, and then in more psychological terms as sociopathic.
Now, Robert Altman, in his book, The Authoritarians, and John Dean did a kind of a sequel to it called Conservatives Without Conscience, heavily referencing Altman's work, suggests that there is a certain baseline percentage of Americans who are authoritarian leaning, who want Big Daddy to guide them, who need authority figures, who crave authority figures even to give them a sense of safety and comfort, and that might be as many as 20-25% of the population. What's the distinction between authoritarian followers, authoritarian leaders, and sociopaths and psychopaths?
Well, oftentimes you find the two of those, if you're looking at a Venn diagram, as overlapping with one another. So when we think about authoritarian tendencies, in fact, those that are following authoritarian type leaders, you can look at it in a couple of ways. One is, are people in a stage in their life or in a part of their life where they're dealing with a lot of different stressors? They're dealing with financial stress, they're dealing with occupational stress, and things just haven't been going right for them. And they can look to an authoritarian type leader, a strongman type leader, as Ruth Ben-Ghiat describes them, as a way out of the darkness, a way out of this distress and strife. So they will adhere to and be gravitated towards somebody with authoritarian tendencies because they're showing them a way out, and they're taking on the burden rather than somebody taking it on for themselves. And another way we look at it is, if somebody was raised in an environment where their parents or their caregivers or their teachers were authoritarian in nature, and that's the environment that they're used to, when they get to their early 20s and their young adult years and they're more independent than they were, oftentimes they're sort of lost and they're sort of adrift, and they gravitate more towards figures that resemble what they had when they were being brought up, which is an authoritarian mother, father, or caregiver, whoever it may be. So you see that reason for gravitating. So that's what tends to lean people towards authoritarianism. Now, when you bring in the idea of sociopathy and psychopathy, what you're doing there is then finding individuals who are like-minded, who want to do what's best for them and care less about what other people think or how they're harmed. And they're enabling and allowing them to carry out and enact these ideas that they have that are psychopathic and sociopathic in nature. So what you've seen over the last several years is really a confluence of those two types of influences. One, this degree of psychopathy and sociopathy that's present, and then this need for an authoritarian type leader to fill some sort of void. And so that marriage has really created a lot of the problems that we've been dealing with. But to your point with the number of people that have these tendencies in society, I like to make this point a lot, whether we're talking about narcissism or we're talking about sociopathy, psychopathy, we have to understand these things exist on a continuum. So all of us in our lives have thoughts and have acted in ways that were self-serving. We've done things that boosted our morale, our confidence, our performance, because it feels good, and that's who we are as human beings. So to say somebody has sociopathic tendencies, psychopathic tendencies, narcissistic tendencies, those are present to some degree in most people. What we're talking about is those that go beyond the tendencies and start to live a life along these ways and start to participate in acts that are morally questionable, corrupt, criminal. Once you've crossed over those societal barriers, what is morally right or wrong, what is criminally right or wrong, then you're talking about people you would say that person is a sociopath, that person is a psychopath, versus there being sociopathic or psychopathic in their behavior. So I just want to make that distinction clear. They're not just labels. It's a continuum that we really can use to describe human nature.
I get it. We're talking with Dr. Seth Norrholm. He is the director of the Neuroscience Center for Anxiety, Stress, and Trauma, Department of Psychiatry at Wayne State University. His piece, A Neuroscientist Warns, we're watching the largest and most dangerous cult in American history. I want to talk about this Trump cult on the other side of this break. Stay with us, Dr. Norrholm. We'll be right back.